Hello, welcome back to the Methodist Perspective. Today we are talking about Calvinism and Arminianism. This video is not going to be a defense of Arminianism so much as a compare and contrast. And it's going to be focused on soteriology specifically because Arminian sacramentology and ecclesiology tends to be the same as your classical Reformed counterparts. Really, Arminianism is just Reformed with a different soteriology. So I'm going to be going through Calvinism and then the 5 points, tulip, and then I'm going to be going through the Arminian responses to those. And a future video will probably be a defense of Arminianism and a full in-depth kind of explanation of it. So first up is Calvinism. Calvinism holds that God determines and ordains all events and actions, and that humans are responsible for their own actions. So they teach compatibilism in that way. The Westminster Confession talks about how God ordains everything, but that second causes are still true causes. So we have in the Westminster Confession, chapter 3, which is titled "Of God's Eternal Decree." It says, God from all eternity did by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. Yet so as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures, nor is the liberty or contingency of second causes taken away, but rather established. So you, as an individual, are a second cause, I suppose, based on, if I understand correctly. You choose to do a thing, you are the second cause, and so you are responsible for your actions in that way. But God has ordained and has sort of. Yeah, he's ordained, he's decreed that will happen. But you are sort of the second cause, and so you are still responsible for your actions, is the Calvinist claim. One sort of analogy that Calvinists like to use, I've heard this many places, a good place to hear it is Redeemed Zoomer's debate with Leighton Flowers. That's Soteriology 101. Leighton Flowers is a provisionist, not an Arminian, but with regard specifically to the Arminian rejection of unconditional election, he can be a good resource for that. But Redeemed Zoomer makes this point, which is that God is sort of like the author of a book. And he writes the universe, and what Redeemed Zoomer kind of points out is like, from the perspective of the characters in the book, they're acting according to their own will. He uses the example of Frodo. Like, Frodo is technically at fault for not throwing the ring into Mount Doom, but Tolkien wrote him to do that. So, take that how you will. Now on to Tulip, because that's more their view of free will and determinism. The Calvinists hold to total depravity, meaning that every person is incapable of choosing to follow God. It does not mean that every person is as evil as they can be. It does not mean like every person is constantly doing everyone's not constantly murdering people, and everyone's not constantly stealing and doing all these other sorts of things. Rather, it means that That's my understanding. Maybe that's more Lutheran. I don't know. Maybe I'm getting this wrong on the Calvinist end, but it seems that it's not necessarily that everyone is doing things that are inherently evil all the time. Rather, no one is capable, no one has free will in terms of heavenly things. No one is capable of choosing to follow God. Verses like, there's none who is good, no, not one, none who chooses to, no one searches for God, all of these sorts of things. So that's important. That's actually a common ground that Arminians have with Calvinists, particularly classical Arminians, because Jacob Arminius was himself a Calvinist before he was not a Calvinist anymore. Arminians also hold to total depravity. And what we mean by that is quite the same thing, I think, that every person is incapable of choosing to follow God on their own. It does not mean that every person is constantly doing evil things. However, we would, and I think the Calvinists also would, say that everything a person does is evil because it is done apart from faith. So, like John Wesley talks about, only corrupt fruit can grow on a corrupt tree. And that, I think, is a common ground that we have with Calvinists, is that we do believe that every action taken by a person before, like every good work, quote unquote, that a person does before they are regenerated, before they have faith, is evil because of the motivation. Even if, like, it wouldn't be evil if done by a Christian, it is because they are a corrupt tree, and therefore all of their works are corrupt fruit. In fact, I would go so far as to say that it's almost a form of idolatry, because they have, for lack of faith, they have made themselves their own God, and therefore all of their works are just trying to, worship themselves almost. Here's the biggest point of difference that everyone's going to think about is the Calvinists hold to unconditional election, which means that before creation, God chose by his divine will everyone who would be saved, completely apart from any sort of condition that has to do with them. They cannot make any sort of choice. They cannot do any sort of good works. They cannot do anything in order to choose to have communion with God. Even when he has worked in them in the Spirit, it is irresistibly worked. The salvation is irresistibly worked in them through the Spirit. And so nobody can choose to follow God. You either are or you aren't. And God has chosen who the ares are and who the are nots are. Now, unconditional reprobation, I think, is a debate within Calvinism that I don't want to get into, which is relevant because the last thing I just said was God chooses who is not saved and who is saved. I think certain Calvinists would disagree on that, but I'm not a Calvinist, so I can't talk too much about that. Redeemed Zoomer is probably a better resource than I am. Many Calvinists also hold to limited atonement, which means that Christ died only for the elect. Others do hold to unlimited atonement or universal atonement, which is a thing affirmed by Lutherans and Arminians, that Christ died for all, but his death is only applied to those who believe. So Arminians have agreement with some Calvinists and disagreement with others. On the point of unconditional election, Arminians do agree that you cannot earn your salvation. So just to get that straight, we do not believe you can earn your salvation. We do believe that you can choose to respond to God's grace. So God works in you. He does not irresistibly work in you. he irresistibly works in you. And so you can respond to that grace. Sort of like the Lutherans, but not quite, because I don't think they believe you can respond positively to God's grace, but they do believe that you can resist God's grace. So I think they believe that, like, if you just don't resist, God will draw you to him. And if you do, like, you are able to resist, but if you don't resist, you're just passively carried along. I don't know that Arminians are down with that, but I'm sure it's probably an acceptable view. I'm not sure it's necessarily the best reading of Scripture, but that's not the point. The point is to compare and contrast the basic ideas. Anyway, so we don't believe you can earn your salvation. So let's get that straight. Calvinists believe in irresistible grace, which means when God ordains to save someone, they are incapable of rejecting that grace. So if God says, you're going to be saved, you're going to be saved. He irresistibly works in you to regenerate you and bring you to salvation. And once he regenerates you, you cannot be not regenerated. So that's the next major one. As I said, Arminians reject that. We believe that you can resist God's grace and that prevenient grace draws you, but it doesn't necessarily draw you without a response on your part. Finally, we believe in, we sort of believe in perseverance of the saints, but they believe in perseverance of the saints. The Calvinists believe in perseverance of the saints, which means that all of God's elect will persevere to the end. Okay. I think that the difference would be that the Calvinist believes that all of God's elect will persevere to the end by virtue of their being elect. And then I think Arminians would say more something along the lines of, that all of God's elect will make it to the end. Yes, because they're elect, but you as an individual will make it will be glorified and will persevere. You individually are elect because you persevere, but the elect as a group will persevere because they are elect, because God has ordained that the elect will persevere. So how do you become elect? By persevering. So I don't know that we'd use the language of like, if you're elect, you'll persevere, but more like, if you're elect, you will be glorified. So I don't think that that's necessarily language we would use, but they believe in perseverance of the saints. That means that all God's elect will persevere to the end. That does not mean, I think, that nobody has some access to some sort of grace or faith who is not elect. You'd have to look into that more, but I think that that's an important distinction. Calvin, I do believe, taught that there are people who are not elect, who are in the church, that are kind of covenantal Christians, or whatever term he used, who have access to some sort of grace by virtue of being in the church, but they are not elect and therefore will not persevere. So then when Christians fall away, you can say, oh, well, they were genuinely part of the church and they had access to some sort of grace, but they weren't elect. So that would seem to be the case. They seem to balance that out. Again, not sure if that's accurate, but not the point. Finally, so Arminians believe that it is possible to have genuine saving faith and reject it. Therefore, it is possible to be elect in Christ at one point and then reject the election and fail to persevere. That would be our distinction. But I don't think, I've used the phrase where we are elect because we persevere, but I don't know that that's actually accurate, per se. But I'll explore more of this stuff in the actual defense of Arminianism that I'll do at a later time. I just need to get everything written down and put together so that it's all nice and organized. Anyway, I hope that was edifying, and I hope that you come away from this video not hating Calvinism, because Calvinism tends to be looked at almost universally as the bad guys of Christianity, you know, the robots and the people that, you know, kind of cold, unfeeling intellectuals of the faith. And I think we need to not think of them that way necessarily. I mean, some of them probably are. You get these, what are they called? I'll have to look up the term. There's some derisive term for like new Calvinists that are super gung-ho about it and constantly telling everyone they're not saved because they're not Calvinist and whatnot. And that does not represent properly Calvinism. And I also don't think that your vaguely Calvinistic non-denominational church that, you know, is kind of mean is necessarily, like, I mean, I've experienced that, but they're not necessarily representative of Calvinists either. And so I don't think we need to look at them as the bad guys of Christianity, and I do hope that any Calvinists listening to this can feel that I actually put effort into understanding their positions, and I'm not trying to caricature them as people who think that, like, God hates everyone except the elect, and, you know, and God is just arbitrarily choosing people and doing all the other sorts of things that non-Calvinists like to throw at Calvinists. So, and if anyone can correct me on any of these things, I would very much like to see that. So if you don't mind, you know, if you have anything for me, just put it in the comments and I'll take a look. And in the next video I do on Arminianism, when I do an actual defense, biblical and historical defense of Arminianism, I will mention those things on which I have been corrected. So I hope you enjoyed that video. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.